Now join us as we go live once again to the United Nations General Assembly, where the representative of Bolivia is taking the stance. Let's listen.
The 80th session isn't just any other date. It is a space for a historic time which invites us to stop and to look back, to remember why this organization was born and why it has seen the results that humanity was waiting for after the two world wars, in which the fight for wealth and areas of influence left in its wake millions of dead, displaced and wounded. We are living with a wound that we're trying to overlook. Over 8 decades, in the concert of nations, we have seen the development of narratives that, using the skill of the great powers with long-standing experience in international community, have camouflaged deep wounds and the devastating memories of humanity. They've done so using smart normative texts that pretend to be the duty of the United Nations through audiovisuals and others that are not very effective in facing flagrant problems such as neocolonialism in all of its expressions, territorial occupation, economic, political and cultural interference, racism, discrimination, the arms race and violence which is implicit in all of this, without taking into account other aspects such as hunger, climate change, the food crisis and the increasingly frequent economic crises. The effects of these realities are clear to all. Confrontations and discourse that promotes hatred and division between kindred states, inequality, exclusion, poverty and inequality and injustice, still produced within institutions that were created to protect the rights of the weakest. And we're not even talking about economic, social and the cultural rights of people, and even more if you look at the rights of indigenous peoples. A sincere assessment leads us to confirm that in 80 years we have not met the expected results. Consequently, we are not in a good position. The world remains divided and confronted against itself more than 80 years ago. Today in the world there is greater inequality in the distribution of wealth than there was 80 years ago. The poverty figures, inequality and injustice, rather than being curbed, is on the increase. The risk that any remaining peace should disappear and the Third World War would overtake the entire planet is very close if we don't react in time. The danger here is that the unstoppable force of capitalism with the misuse of artificial intelligence would increase the climate change, would liquidate the planet and would convert the immense majority of the population into unnecessary beings, is also something that we can't completely rule out. We're not in a good place. The UN was established on the basis of the foundations of the skeletons of the Holocaust and the not only physical but also moral ruins left by the fascist racism and also increasing neocolonialism with the use of 2 atomic bombs. One of the goals that gave rise to the United Nations was to not repeat the barbarity of war. Today we hear the echoes of the drums of war on all continents. We see the practice of genocide on the sole decision of 2 countries. We deny the right to be free and sovereign to a people. Sophisticated weapons are used against a sovereign country, and increasing militarization is being promoted within a region with double standards in combating the war on drugs. And at the same time, we maintain a criminal blockade against its people and the state for the sole crime of having claimed its own independence more than 6 decades ago. Wars are not the same as we had 80 years ago. Wars now are multidimensional. They use economic, financial, media, information, cyber warfare, without even taking into account military warfare, which now encompasses biological warfare, war from space, and other technologies that continue to be developed with impunity on the basis of technology of war. It would be nothing new to have climate wars that would have an impact on sovereignty and food security, jeopardizing strategic resources such as water. We are putting at risk the very survival of the human race on Earth and of life itself on the planet. Just taking off the mask from all of these tragedies, we can see that the cause of all of this is the wild capitalist system that places the greed of the few over the rights and lives of the majority on the planet. The cause of this is the current capitalist development, which tries to resolve its own crisis and ends up returning to the original forms of accumulation and increasing rates of profit. Capitalism and its imperialist face is once again using the deployment of violence, plundering natural resources from sovereign states, and with bloodletting to lead to the political and economic power and take that away from another. Added to that, we have a third cause of the current wars, which is more immediate. That is the obsessive zeal of the new Trump administration to give the United States back its position as a hegemonic power at the cost of the liberal system, free trade, globalization, and to cause pain and death. Why? For what? To take ownership over natural resources, to take control over commodities for the benefit of an imperialist system, and to subordinate the majority of countries for their insatiable thirst for privilege and wealth, and to try to maintain a unipolar order at any cost. The recent publication of the US Strategic Defense Policy sets out a deployment of its troops around the world to in its areas of influence, Canada, Central and South America, among others. The recent history with our neighbors has made us realize this is nothing else but a new way of implementing Monroeism, which was a doctrine which said that America is for the North Americans, generating conditions for a new era of neocolonialism. Madam President, distinguished heads of state and government, from the indigenous name for Latin America and the Caribbean, we can say that we are a zone of peace, and we did so at the second summit of CELAC in Havana in 2014. The nations in our region are complying with this mandate that we set ourselves, still bearing in mind our political and ideological differences on various topics and with regard to border and territorial occupation-based disputes that remain ongoing. We can say, when we invert the equation of the Pentagon, that it is peace rather than war that guides our international relations. In hearing this declaration statement in 2022 in this same place, I came to appeal to the United Nations for a General Assembly to declare to the world that it would be an entire territory of peace. And 11 years have passed since that historic declaration of CELAC, and 3 years since I made that statement in this assembly. Not only have we not declared the world as a zone of peace, rather we are facing the harsh reality of seeing how death is becoming increasingly normalized in international relations. We also feel the threat of fascism in all of its variants to try to exploit and dominate peoples at the current time. The threat of death has made is covering Latin America and the Caribbean. We are seeing a bellicose potential, which would even go so far as to use missiles, submarines, helicopters, using the pretext that this maritime space is being used against the national security of the United States, through the illegal introduction of cocaine through illegal gangs belonging to drug cartels. Beyond violations of international law, this provocative action of imperialism has two intentions. First, to intervene into our kindred Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, that since 1999 has been raising high the flags of the freedom of its people and the sovereignty of its state, and which possesses considerable natural resources, particularly in oil, which the North wishes to appropriate and claim. Secondly, to try to reconquer the Latin America and the Caribbean on the basis of it undermining liberal democracy, to impose militarization and to use other colonialist practices that we should call out. Imperialism is said to be used to combat drugs trafficking. This is a fallacy, because if this were true, it would actually be taking effect within their own country, where the demand for this type of drugs is high, and where in its origins, where we see different types of organized crime. What the United States is trying to do is to give our region the role of holding back the edification of a multipolar world and to submit it to its own interests. Added to these military actions, the images of which have been seen around the world, we see other types of devastating actions, such as those aimed at strengthening the economic blockade against Cuba. Billions of dollars are owed by the United States to the Cuban state due to these unilateral coercive measures, which are explained on the basis of rejecting the first communist revolution, which will never be destroyed. The threat of death is also afflicting the Middle East. In the Middle East, the pain of millions of families and the death of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians finds no consolation. All of this history tells us has the unconditional support of the United States, which wants to speed up the displacement of the Palestinian people as quickly as possible. Peace will be an empty world while the Palestinian people continues to face practices of genocide and does not have its own land and full sovereignty with East Jerusalem as its capital. But in this region, that's not the only thing that's happening. The fragile political and geopolitical stability is threatened by preventive attacks against the Islamic Republic of Iran and against the small nation of Yemen, very similarly to what is happening, what was done by ex-President George Bush. The threat of death is also clear in Eurasia. in Eurasia, despite the intermittent attempts to achieve a political outcome, the expansionist ambitions of NATO, which is nothing else than the military arm of concentrated capital, is trying to protract the military conflict by using Ukraine as a launch pad against the Russian Federation. The threat of death also hangs over Asia. The East China Sea, which is an area of great geostrategic and economic importance, is facing two problems that could have an impact not only on the region but also the entire world. The overcoming of the sovereignty of Taiwan by the People's Republic of China is another example of explicit neocolonialism that is encouraged by the United States, as well as the dispute on the Senkaku Islands, the sovereignty of which is disputed between Japan, Taiwan, and China. It appears that these islands are home to important hydrocarbon resources. Furthermore, the constant tension between North Korea and South Korea could not only become a problem that affects these two countries, but also the entire security of the world. Heads of state and government, I've been referring to this entire world to say that in this new imperialist intervention, we should call it what it is, neocolonialism. And what should we do? I'm asking this because it's led to one of the most outstanding strategies of the fight for the emancipation of labor over capital. This is also the fight of life over death. I wish to propose that we firstly establish a commission for reparations following slavery, apartheid, genocide, and colonialism in the countries of the global south. To do so, the United Nations should find a way to ensure that those designing war and death pay their billions of dollars rather into a reparations fund. I hope that this rostrum, the highest on the international stage, will also serve to be able to launch an appeal and recognize that colonialism and neocolonialism was and is an historic mistake that brings and continues to bring a social wound over the population that it victimizes. It also does this with indigenous societies that it affects in particular. Today, on behalf of the construction of a fair future, we have to condemn the devastating impact of colonialism in the past and the present. I appeal to the heads of state of CELAC and the African Union to join forces and to oppose the adverse consequences of colonialism. This commission that I've mentioned should set up effective mechanisms to restore historic justice in the following spheres: reparations, land rights, recovery of the environment destroyed through the action of the colonizers and transnational corporations, apologies for the colonial past through the restitution of cultural goods of the indigenous peoples that were taken by the colonizers during the period of expansion and genocide, the prevention of neocolonial practices, programs for the development of indigenous peoples and the preservation of their cultural identity. We should also provide compensation to people who have resisted the military occupation of their territories and those that are suffering under unilateral sanctions and economic blockades. Secondly, we should convert the UN General Assembly into a body with binding power so that it can be an effective voice for all peoples and not a space where we simply realize the will of the most powerful. We need this forum to be an ethical nucleus, a political heart, and the living spirit of a new era guided by the culture of life. We need the resolutions adopted within the UN General Assembly to not be vetoed by any superpower and to be truly complied with. This means ensuring that multilateralism is truly valid and not just a formality. We should declare the world as a zone of peace and promote demilitarization as far as possible. The immense majority of the population in the world refuses to accept that the revitalization or overcoming the cyclical crises of capital should be done on the basis of investment in billions of dollars to manufacture all types of conventional and unconventional weapons. Just 1/3 of military expenditure would give us better and greater education, health and housing guaranteed for everyone. The UN has to become a pact for peace and for life as the shared destiny of everyone who believes in living together. 4, we need to undertake a profound reform of the Security Council that would prevent one of two countries holding up global stability. We need to ensure this reform and ensure the reform that the countries of the Global South have been insisting on for several years. Democratizing the Security Council would be giving effect to the principle of the legal equality of states and democratizing the future. It would be to ensure that the voices of Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia and the historically marginalized peoples would also count. 5, we should move towards the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. Bolivia, together with the Amazonian peoples, speaks up to recall the urgent need for international cooperation to strengthen the conservation of the Amazon. We should do so through strengthening the sovereignty of Amazonian countries over this strategic biome for the world. Defending the Amazon means defending life. 6, we must reject all forms of commercial war and work to reduce economic and social divides between the countries of central capitalism and the countries on the periphery. Trade wars not only affect companies, but also the immense world of work. It also lessens to alarming levels the possibility for lower classes to access acceptable food. The hegemonic and capitalist interests don't have any right to overtake rights of trade and reduce the right to employment, food and education for the working classes. Dear guests here at the 80th session of the UN General Assembly, I'm very grateful that on this occasion of the 80th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations, having listened to the analysis and the outlook of the plurinational state of Bolivia over critical problems facing us today, and as we look ahead to working together for peace, development and collective human rights, the Bolivian people, to whom we have guaranteed a democratic transit that we have not seen in 28 years in our country, is looking forward to seeing the changes that we must see within the United Nations in order to guarantee global peace. Thank you very much.
Gracias. On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Constitutional President of the Plurinational State of Bolivia. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Brice Clotaire Oligui Nguema, President of the Gabonese Republic, Head of State and Head of Government. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President of the General Assembly, distinguished heads of state and government, distinguished Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I would like to most warmly and sincerely congratulate Her Excellency Annalena Baerbock on her election as President of this 80th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Madam President, your experience, I am sure, will allow you to effectively carry out the missions of your august post. Rest assured of the full cooperation of my country. To His Excellency Philemon Yang, your predecessor, I pay tribute to the outstanding work carried out during his term. And lastly, I would like to once again commend His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of our organization, for all of the efforts that he has constantly made since he took up his office. Gabon, my country, is keenly interested in the UN 80 initiative, which aims at ensuring operational efficiency in the face of global challenges, as well as to optimize mandates within the UN system. Madam President, 1 year ago, before this prestigious assembly, as the President of the transition of the Republic of Gabon, I presented the political process begun in my country after the liberation coup which took place on August 30th, 2023. After the presidential election of April 12th, 2025, for which the process and outcomes were unanimously endorsed by the international community, this transition culminated with my inauguration on May 3rd, 2025, as the first elected president of the Gabonese Republic, thus establishing the foundations of democratic order. As you know, Gabon has undergone a peaceful and exemplary transition that included all of the political parties in our nation. This smooth transition led to an inclusive national dialogue and a constitutional referendum in accordance with the agreed-upon timelines, and it will continue through the holding of legislative, local, and senatorial elections that are free and transparent. To this end, the first and second round of combined legislative and local elections will take place on September 27th and October 11th, 2025. With regard to the election of senators, this will take place on November 8th, and the second round is scheduled for November 29th, 2025, with a view toward a definitive restoration of constitutional order by January 2026. We believe that this peaceful and historic process can serve as a lesson and a model in many other spheres. The people of Gabon have drawn this success from its history, its culture of peace, and its shared vision of the future. Here I would like to express, on behalf of the Gabonese people and on my own behalf, our sincere gratitude to the United Nations for its multifaceted assistance. I know that I can count on the support of the UN as we implement our National Growth and Development Plan. This plan focuses on bolstering our energy capacity, on strengthening infrastructure, developing the digital sector, and on enhancing youth employment. Ladies and gentlemen, Gabon is standing before you again with a clear message. Our country has changed. After decades of tensions and political and economic missteps, the Gabonese people has chosen the path of reconciliation and renewal, thus becoming the symbol of and testament to the transformation of hardship into hope, of dependency into dignity, of division into unity, and all without bloodshed. Today, Gabon is no longer a country in limbo. It has returned to stand alongside other states, upright, dignified, and ready to take up its rightful place in the community of nations. The new Gabon, the exemplary Gabon that my compatriots are calling for, also means that the state in Gabon must serve its people from now on. But our national rebirth would be futile without a change in the international order. It is no longer acceptable for African nations to remain relegated to the role of providers of raw materials for which others set the price and from which others profit. Therefore, I would like to invite public and private investors to support us through win-win partnerships. We have decided to process our resources on our territory, to create jobs at home, to develop African industries, and to interact with the world on the basis of equity, integrity, and mutual respect as we strive toward happiness. In its path toward development, Gabon, a country of peace and opportunity, will continue to welcome all those who commit to upholding our laws, our Republican values, and to contributing positively to our national rise. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this 80th session of the General Assembly has the theme, Better Together, 80 Years and More for Peace, Development, and Human Rights. It takes place in an international context characterized by economic, environmental, and security crises that call for more sustained and more staunch collective engagement. This is an urgent call to tackle these concerns in accordance with the spirit and the values of the UN Charter. Ladies and gentlemen, today the world has a radically different face. Humanity has never had so much technological prowess to ensure its well-being, and yet international peace and security have never seemed so fragile and so under threat. It is high time that peace reign on earth, and especially in Africa, which has so long suffered under conflicts that have been stoked and financed from outside the continent. Let the guns at last fall silent in the DRC, in Sudan, in the Horn of Africa, and in the Sahel. In this regard, instead of constantly stigmatizing and condemning the states of the Sahel, the international community would benefit from supporting them in their battle against the many-headed threat of terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, on December 12, 1988, Gabon officially recognized the State of Palestine. Then, as now, we support the two-state solution, the only way, in accordance with UN resolutions, to guarantee a just and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians, as well as to guarantee international security. In this vein, Gabon must reaffirm its position in favor of lifting the embargo imposed on Cuba due to its negative effect on the well-being of Cuba's people. we solemnly reaffirm our full support for international efforts carried out throughout the world to achieve peace. These efforts must be centered on humans, especially women and youth. Through the Pact for the Future of 2024, the UN must continue to encourage and support the crucial action of women, stemming from the Declaration and the Beijing Declaration and Program of Action, of which we're celebrating the 30th anniversary this year. Madam President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution is an existential threat for humanity. And yet, the efforts of the international community to address these challenges remain drastically inadequate. The Treaty on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions, which we have just ratified, fills a legal gap and provides an ambitious framework for equitable and sustainable governance of biodiversity. Together, we have a real opportunity to make this treaty a true driver of transformation for present and future generations. Gabon is the guardian of part of the Congo Basin, the second largest green lung of our planet. This extraordinary heritage must not be sacrificed to financial rapacity. We call for an equitable global partnership in which the protection of our forests is accompanied by fair compensation for the ecological services these forests provide to humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, the new global order is underway. The changes taking place in our societies are inevitable and cannot be overlooked. International peace and justice can only be guaranteed by a revitalized multilateralism, in particular through Security Council reform that takes into account the African claims enshrined in the Sirte Declaration and the Eswatini Consensus, to which Gabon is firmly committed. I wish every success to our work, and I wish a happy birthday to our organization. Thank you.
I thank you and happy birthday to all of us. On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Gabonese Republic, Head of State and Head of Government. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At this 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, I'd like to speak about Africa's role in the future of this organization. However, it's impossible to do that without first considering the collective role that Africa played in its founding, which was small and relatively insignificant. Of the 51 member states involved in the founding of the United Nations in 1945, only 4 were African: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. It is important to point out that the United Nations came into being in the aftermath of World War II because of the inability of its predecessor, the League of Nations, to avert a large-scale global conflict, which had been its guiding purpose when it was founded in 1920 at the end of the First World War. Out of the 42 founding member states of the League of Nations, only 3 were African: Liberia, the Union of South Africa, and Ethiopia. Egypt was to join later in 1937. Africa's overall participation in the organization's founding was minimal and relatively unimportant. That's because before all the other talks and meetings, representatives from a group of 14 nations gathered in Berlin for a series of discussions that began in 1884 and which led to the partitioning and formal colonization of the African continent, which is also called the Scramble for Africa. It has famously been written that past is prologue. Well, in the past, the majority of the 54 nations that now comprise Africa were never offered a seat at the table where plans for a new world order were being drawn. But, Madam President, as fate would have it, the tables are turning, and Africa's role in the authorship of whatever is yet to come for this world is going to be huge, and it will be consequential. According to this organization's own projections, by the year 2050, more than 25% of the world's population is expected to come from the African continent. Additionally, by 2050, 1/3 of all young people aged between 15 to 24 will be residing on the African continent. So you see, the future of this world is African. Allow me to say this once again a little louder for those of you in the back. The future is African. Already today, Africa is a catalyst for human potential and development, as well as for economic reform and ecological stability. Africa is a catalyst for systemic change. If this reality, which is fact-based and straightforward, seems provocative or unsettling, perhaps it's because you are viewing it through the lens of centuries of filters, colonialism and imperialism, and the resulting implicit bias. Maybe you are unaware of the resilience of African nations or their remarkable ability to make a strong comeback just when you think it's safe to count them out. That is what is happening right now in my own country, Ghana. Our constitution limits leaders to 2 4-year terms. In January, I was sworn in for a second term, which, let me point out, was non-consecutive with my first term. Our currency, the Ghana cedi, was rapidly depreciating, faced with rising inflation, a huge debt burden, and low morale amongst our citizens. My new administration settled down quickly and embarked on an ambitious program of comprehensive transformation designed to restructure Ghana's economic foundation and enhance our competitive standing globally. We refer to this process of recalibration as our reset agenda. In just 8 months, we have achieved significant reduction in inflation from 23.8% in December 2024 to 11.5% in August 2025, restoring price stability for our citizens. Additionally, our currency, the Ghana cedi, has appreciated considerably against other currencies, with Bloomberg reporting it as the best performing currency in the world at one point. Our improved sovereign credit rating reflects increasing investor confidence in our economy. And our 24-hour economy initiative promises to transform our economy. And there's a renewed willingness amongst our people to trust that their elected officials have Ghana's interests at heart and that we're progressing together. Madam President, I believe that in honor of this milestone celebration, the United Nations should also embark on a process of serious recalibration and establish its own reset agenda. Since the organization's founding, the number of UN member nations has nearly quadrupled. And quite frankly, it is not the same world that it was back then when the UN was formed. I mentioned earlier that I began my second non-consecutive term as president this past January. My first term ended in January 2017. In that span of time, 8 years, the world has changed with such ferocity. My first days in office after my return felt as though I had just awakened from a Rip Van Winkle-style sleep. Now, note, that was only after 8 years. Imagine then what it will be like after 80 years since the founding of the United Nations. In 1945, the sun had not yet set on the largest empire in history. The most common mode of international travel was by sea. The personal computer had not been invented, let alone made portable. And television, a new convenience, was still in its infancy, albeit in black and white color. Relations between the US and the Soviet Union were turning frosty, with Winston Churchill declaring that an iron curtain has descended across the European continent. Fast track 80 years on, in today's world, hundreds of thousands of commercial flights take off and land every day. Libraries have been digitized so that volumes of literature can exist on a small device, small enough to fit inside your pocket. We live in a world of cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, social media, the internet and its dark hidden dungeon of the dark web, all of which carry a potential threat to global peace and security. Climate change is real, and we're fighting a losing battle against the loss of Maldives and other island nations to the rising sea level, against the loss of Timbuktu to desertification and the Amazon forest to global warming and deforestation. Madam President, the UN Founding Charter is outdated when it comes to representation in this August Assembly. The most powerful post-World War II nations are still being rewarded with an almost totalitarian guardianship over the rest of the world. And yet, the first sentence in Chapter 2, Article 1 of the UN Charter declares that the organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. If this were true, and was the case, a continent as large as Africa, with its numerous UN member states, would have at least one permanent seat on the Security Council. Furthermore, we believe that veto power should not be restricted to only 5 nations, nor should it be absolute. There must be a mechanism in this House for the General Assembly to challenge a veto. No single nation should be able to exercise an absolute veto to serve its own interests in a dispute. In 1995, during the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, Nelson Mandela stood in this very spot, and he said, "The United Nations has to reassess its role, redefine its profile, and reshape its structures. It should truly reflect the diversity of our universe and ensure equity among the nations in the exercise of power within the system of international relations in general and the Security Council in particular." I close quotations. 30 years later, we African leaders are still making the same simple request for a permanent seat on the Security Council with the power of a veto. So today, Madam President, I stand here in this exact spot and ask the world, if not now, then when? We demand not only a reform of the Security Council, but also a reset of the global financial architecture, which is currently rigged against Africa. Africa must have a greater say in the world's multilateral financial institutions. And while I'm making requests, I'd like to call for the removal of the blockade on Cuba. As Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, our nation's founder, famously said, "We seek to be friends with all and enemies to none." The Cuban people shed their blood on African soil in the fight against apartheid. And indeed, Cuba has been and continues to be a faithful friend of Africa. You see, the very fact that I can stand here and ask these things and say these things, and the fact that all nations can ostensibly gather here to address critical global issues, air our grievances, and express our concerns, that is what makes the survival of this organization so important. In every old city or village, you'll find a town square, or a courtyard, or a plaza that once served as a gathering space for the citizens of the community and their leaders. Meetings and celebrations were held there, as were trials and elections. And these were spaces that brought people together and held them together as a community. Sadly, time and technology have eroded these spaces. Madam President, in many ways, the United Nations is the proverbial town square of our modern global village. And it has never been more critical for us to protect this one space that brings and holds the world nations together as a community. The internet, social media platforms, and artificial intelligence offer us the illusion of connectivity, when in fact what they do is reinforce isolation by using algorithms that ensure that we do not receive new ideas and perspectives, but rather more of the same content. We are served alternative facts and manipulated images, making it easy to disseminate disinformation and sow seeds of division amongst communities. Madam President, these are dangerous times. Our world is currently experiencing a rise in nationalism and economic instability. There's a general breakdown of multilateralism. Various acts of aggression have been committed against the sovereignty of others, and nations are attempting to circumvent the very safeguards that were put in place to prevent large-scale global conflict. These conditions are all too similar to the ones that led to the League of Nations' failure in fulfilling its mandate. The denial of visas to President Abbas and the Palestinian delegation sets a bad precedent and should be deeply worrying to all member nations of the United Nations. Ghana recognized the state of Palestine in 1988 and supported a two-state solution to the conflict since then. And I say, contrary to the claims of some, a two-state solution would not be a reward for Hamas. It would rather be a reprieve for the hundreds of thousands of innocent women and children and people who are facing collective punishment and forced starvation for no reason other than the fact that they are Palestinian. For nearly 2 years and for the fear of reprisals, we here in this General Assembly have been playing hide and seek with language to find the right words to help us avoid or excuse what we all know is taking place in Gaza. But here is the thing, it doesn't matter what you call it. If it looks like a duck, it swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, well, then it must be a duck. The crimes in Gaza must stop. The crimes in Gaza must stop. Madam President, I also want to draw particular attention to the conflict in Sudan, which this body has described as the world's largest humanitarian crisis. 12 million people have had to flee their homes. And when we speak of migration, we refer to the 12 million new Sudanese refugees, whom we as a global community should be willing to assist in much the same way that many member nations readily assisted new refugees coming out of Ukraine. Let's dispense with the euphemisms and dog whistles and speak frankly. It is not a mystery that when leaders of Western nations complain of their migration problems, they are often referring to immigrants from the global south. But many of those immigrants are climate refugees. And interestingly, the global north emits 75% more greenhouse gases than the global south. However, the effects of climate change are more severe in the global south because we lack the resources to address them effectively. And so when the desert encroaches on our villages and towns and they become unlivable, we are forced to flee. Warsan Shire, a Somali-born prophet, a Somali-British poet born in Kenya to Somalian refugee parents, was London's first youth poet laureate. She writes in her poem titled Home. And it says, you have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one bends their palms under trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than just a journey. Madam President, we cannot normalize cruelty. We cannot normalize hatred. We cannot normalize xenophobia and racism. If we're going to tell a story, let's not tell it slant. Let's tell all the truth. When we speak of migrants, we speak of Mami Ewusi Mensah Frimpong, a judge on the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. She's the first black female judge on any of California's 4 federal district courts. She was born here in America to immigrant parents from Ghana. We speak of Peter Bosman, a medical doctor in Ghana who moved to the town of Piran in Slovenia in the 1980s and later became the first black mayor of Piran, the first black mayor in Slovenia and in the whole of Eastern Europe. We speak of T. Michael, the iconic Ghanaian Norwegian artist and designer. And of course, we speak of the late Kofi Annan, former United Nations Secretary General. Former United Nations Secretary General and Nobel Peace Prize recipient, who was born in Ghana but spent his adulthood in various places in America and Europe. These are people who have brought great distinction to the countries that they decided to call home. Just as the migrants and the children of migrants before them did, I dare say these are not invaders. These are not criminals. Madam President, the slave trade must be recognized as the greatest crime against humanity. As the African champion on reparations, Ghana intends to introduce a motion in this August body to that effect. More than 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken against their will and transported to create wealth for the powerful Western nations. We must demand reparations for the enslavement of our people and the colonization of our land that resulted in the theft of our natural resources, as well as the looting of artifacts and other items of cultural heritage that have yet to be returned in total. We recognize the value of our land and the value of our lives, as did our colonizers, as well as the governments that happily paid reparations to former slave owners as compensation for the loss of their property, in quotes, and that property for which they received compensation was paid referred to enslaved people who had been freed. Madam President, an increasingly insecure world is witnessing upward spending on defense budgets of bilateral partners and steep cuts in official development assistance. Since July 2024, it is estimated that there's been a 40% drop in humanitarian aid globally. In this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. The days of parceling out vast concession areas to foreign interests for exploitation must come to an end. We'll continue to welcome foreign investment, but we must negotiate better for a bigger share of the natural resources that belong to us. And we must insist on value addition to these resources. We're tired of the continued image of poverty-stricken, disease-ridden rural communities living at the periphery of huge foreign-controlled natural resource concession areas. We're tired of having people extract the most they can from us and in return offer us the very least by way of respect, consideration, and dignity. We're tired of not being represented in ways that reveal the richness and complexity of our history or acknowledge all that we have overcome to arrive here in this liminal space of untold possibilities. Allow me to echo the Indian-American writer Arundhati Roy, who wrote, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her briefing." I want to add that for the sake of Africa, and quite selfishly for the sake of my 18-year-old daughter, I hope that this new world that is arriving is a place of safety and equality for women and girls. To succeed, we must empower everyone, including women and girls, to reach their full potential. In closing, Madam President, I'd like to congratulate you on your election to preside over this historic 80th General Assembly and on being the 5th woman to hold this distinction. I'd also like to congratulate Her Excellency Nana Jane Opoku-Agyeman on being the first woman Vice President of Ghana. Now every Ghanaian girl knows the heights to which she can ascend. Words matter, but issues of representation matter even more, which is why Ghana looks forward to the appointment of a woman as Secretary General of this organization in the near future. Madam President, Your Excellencies, I thank you for your kind attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Ghana. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Omaho O.C. Sokang Embalo, President of the Republic of Guinea-Bissau. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Madam President, distinguished heads of state and government, Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to begin by congratulating Mrs. Annalena Baerbock on her election as President of the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I thank the outgoing President, Mr. Philemon Yang, for his service to the international community. To Secretary General Antonio Guterres, I wish to reaffirm Guinea-Bissau's full support for his tireless efforts in favor of world peace, international cooperation, multilateralism, and sustainable 80 years ago, the founders of the United Nations pledged to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That promise, unfortunately, has not yet been fully fulfilled. Yet this commitment, undertaken by each member state upon joining the UN Charter, remains valid and continues to be honored through the dedication of every UN peacekeeper and every humanitarian worker who often make the difference between life and death in conflict zones or following natural disasters. UN agencies such as WHO, UNESCO, UNICEF, FAO, WFP, UNHCR, and UNDP, among others, provide treatment, education, vaccines, food, and protect every day millions of human beings and contribute to the fight against poverty and discrimination against women and girls all over the world. The United Nations remains relevant, especially in these times of deep global uncertainty and crisis. It continues to be the only forum where all nations, large and small, have a seat and a voice. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world confronted by multiple crises. We are witnessing what Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called polycrisis. Conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, and other regions persist. Socioeconomic inequalities, environmental shocks, political instability, and humanitarian emergencies disproportionately affect developing countries, with the greatest impact on small island developing states. Progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals has slowed significantly or even stalled. The sovereign debt burden of poor countries is increasing, while development assistance is declining. Guinea-Bissau welcomes the UN 80 initiative, and we hope it will contribute to strengthening the organization, especially in promoting peace, international security, and the achievement of the SDGs. The Pact for the Future offers a roadmap and an action plan that must not remain on paper. Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, last July, Guinea-Bissau hosted the 15th Conference of Heads of State and Government of the Community of Portuguese-Speaking Countries, CPLP. I have taken on the presidency of the CPLP for the 2025-2027 term. The CPLP places high importance on its cooperation with the United Nations and its specialized agencies. During our term, we will continue to work with all partners and multilateral organizations toward the implementation of global commitments, especially concerning the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the 3rd UN Ocean Conference, and the 4th UN Conference on Financing for Development, held last June-July in Seville. We are convinced that 2 major international meetings scheduled for November, namely COP30 in Belém, Brazil, and the 2nd World Summit for Social Development in Doha, Qatar, will serve as key platforms and opportunities to strengthen our cooperation and to advance our shared goals. Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Guinea-Bissau is scheduled to hold presidential and legislative elections on the 23rd of November this year. All necessary conditions are being put in place to ensure that these elections are held peacefully, freely, transparently, and credibly. Over the past 5 years, I have prioritized dialogue, inclusion, political stability, and the consolidation of the democratic rule of law. I am confident that these upcoming elections will reaffirm the irreversible nature of citizenship and democratic values in Guinea-Bissau. Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude by saying that in an increasingly interdependent world, we need, now more than ever, a world order grounded in the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, in respect for international law and in peaceful coexistence. In this regard, Guinea-Bissau reiterates our call for an end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo and other forms of restrictions imposed on Cuba. 80 years after the creation of the United Nations, the world has changed. We are no longer just the 51 countries who signed the UN Charter in 1945. Today, the United Nations is all of us, the 193 member states, plus observer states, NGOs, civil society organizations, and other actors represented in this great assembly hall. To meet the challenges of the 21st century, the UN must undertake urgent reforms, reforms that reflect today's geopolitical realities and global power balances, reforms that expand and democratize the Security Council, reforms that provide a place and a voice to the Global South, reforms that restore confidence in the multilateralism and international cooperation. The UN continues to be a unique multilateral space where dialogue is still possible, even when diplomacy and good offices fail elsewhere and in other circumstances. The legitimacy, strength, and future of the UN lie in the inclusion and full participation of all of us in deliberations and decision-making. Its core details, peace, dignity, equality, poverty eradication, cooperation, and peaceful resolution of conflicts remain alive and continue to inspire the purposes of the international community and the March of Humanity. Thank you very much.
These are the informations that are generating at this hour from the third day of debates of the United Nations General Assembly. Key topics are centered in the debate: multilateralism, the end of the genocide against the people of Palestine, unilateral sanctions, climate change, and much more. Stay tuned with teleSUR English to stay informed on everything that is going on in the United Nations.